An important concept to understand before moving into JavaScript and jQuery is the Document Object Model, or the DOM. The DOM is best defined as a tree of objects created by your web browser when the web page loads. Your web browser uses the DOM to interpret the page and display its contents. Let's take a look at the model illustrated as a flowchart. At the top of the model hierarchy, we have our actual HTML document. For example, index.html or main.html, whatever the case may be. Inside our HTML document, we have our root element, which is the HTML open tag. Inside the root element, we have several other elements, for example, the head tag and title tag. The root element also holds the body element, which can contain links, paragraphs, headings, divs, and just about any other element we can use to develop the content of our page. Each of these elements can have text content and attributes. For example, the A element contains an href attribute, which contains a textual link. The DOM is important to understand because it allows the elements on a web page to be dynamically changed or updated using JavaScript or the jQuery library. This means we can change HTML elements, attributes, and CSS styles when different events are triggered. For example, if a button is clicked or a page is loaded, just to name a few. We can specify which elements to update or change on an event using three methods. First, we can use the tag name. Say for example we wanted to change all the text contained within h1 tags to red. In this case, we would specify the h1 tags in our JavaScript. If we wanted to change a specific element, we can refer to it using an ID. For example, we can assign the ID equals text to a paragraph element, so p_id equals text. We can then modify the element or any of its attributes using JavaScript. Thirdly, and similar to the ID method, we can also refer to an element by assigning it a class. For example, if we wanted to modify a list element, a specific list element, we could attach the class bullet1, for example. And we could change it using JavaScript as well. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at a few examples of how we can change elements inside the document object model. In this lesson, we'll take a look at a basic example of DOM manipulation using JavaScript. In the JavaScript portion of this course, we'll cover many more methods. Here, we have a basic HTML document. Inside the body tag, we have a JavaScript function named changeText. This function will change any text contained within an element to the words new text. Outside of our script, we have an h1 tag with an onClick event attached to it. The onClick event will execute the changeText function. This means that the text inside the h1 element, click here, will change to the words new text, as defined in our function. Let's take a look at this in our web browser to confirm it works. You can see that when I click on the words click here, it changes to new text. And so we've manipulated the document object model. So far, we've worked with HTML and CSS. We know that both these programming languages instruct our web browser on how our web page should be displayed. We also learned that HTML and CSS are static languages that do not interact with users. In this section of the course, we'll be exploring a very powerful client-side programming language known as JavaScript. When we say client-side, it means the language communicates with our web browser to allow user-to-web page interactivity. Client-side languages differ from server-side languages such as PHP, which we'll cover later on. Server-side languages communicate not with a web browser, but with a web server. JavaScript can be used to implement many different types of interactive features on a web page. Let's take a look at some examples of JavaScript functions that interact with users. This JavaScript code calculates the amount of characters a user has typed into a text area. Once you type in the line of text and press the Calculate Characters button, you'll see that this line of text has 23 characters. This JavaScript code displays an error message if more than 10 words were typed into a text area. This is the pop-up alert that appears if more than 10 words are typed in. This JavaScript code validates a form to make sure that the required fields were completed. I've purposely put an incorrect email address and left the other fields blank. These fields are required. So once we click Submit, we receive an error message saying that some of the required fields were not completed. This is done using JavaScript validation. We'll explore much more advanced validation techniques than this. This is just a basic example. This JavaScript code ensures a user agrees to the terms and conditions of a web page in order to submit a form. If I do not check off this checkbox here, you'll notice I get a pop-up message saying that we must check the box to continue. And again, this is another JavaScript function. This is a slightly more advanced script. It's a tic-tac-toe game. And the purpose is to line up the X's or O's all in one straight line, diagonally, horizontally, or vertically. And so you can see if you lose, a pop-up message appears indicating that the game is over and you've lost. These are just a few basic examples of what JavaScript can be used for. JavaScript does have some limitations. We've already touched on one in that it cannot be used to communicate with a web server. JavaScript cannot be forced onto a user's web browser either. Remember, JavaScript is a client-side language, meaning if your user has turned off JavaScript support in their web browser, your script will not work. Also, if the user's web browser is outdated, it may not allow certain JavaScript functions to work correctly. Note that almost all modern web browsers support JavaScript by default when installed. Many people also confuse JavaScript with Java. Note that these are two languages and they are not the same. Java is a much more powerful and complex language in the same category as C and C++. JavaScript is an object-oriented language. This means that attributes of an object are contained within variables. For example, if we want to describe a person, we'll refer to this person as the object. We would typically use attributes such as name, height, weight, gender, and age. The values of these attributes will vary or differ from person to person. Another word for attributes is variables. These variables will contain the values for each person. As we progress through this section, you'll gain a better understanding of this concept and the importance of working with variables. Similar to CSS, JavaScript functions are most commonly placed in between the open and close head tags. The reason for this is because the head portion of an HTML page gets loaded before any other part of the HTML document. So if you were to put your JavaScript code right before the closing body tag, any JavaScript calls made to functions by your page as it loads will result in an error. Let's take a look at an example of a JavaScript function located in our head tag and called upon in our body. We won't get too much into the HTML here because by now most of this HTML code should look familiar. This JavaScript code will calculate your age in dog years. A year of a person's life is equivalent to 7 years of a dog's life. Let's preview this file before we take a look at the code. As you can see, we input our age in the first input field. I'll put 1 just for demonstration. Once we press calculate, the JavaScript function is called. It reads the value in the first input and multiplies it by 7. It places the result in the second input. In the code, we can see that the script for the JavaScript function is located in the head tag. The function itself is called cYears. This function takes the value of the form element, my age, and multiplies it by 7. The result is then displayed in the form element dog age. The entire function is activated when the user clicks the calculate button. This is when the JavaScript function is called. We can see an on-click event attached to the button. We'll explore different events later in this course. JavaScript can be inserted into a separate document and called when necessary. This is known as an external JavaScript file. You might recall we did the same with our external CSS file. Let's take the JavaScript function in our previous lesson and insert it into a new file. I'm going to copy out the entire function. I'm going to cut it. I'm going to create a new file and paste it. Now I'm going to save this file as dogage.js. JS stands for JavaScript. Now in the head tag, we need to call this script. And we'll do that by adding a source attribute to the script tag. Now we'll save this file, and I'll preview it in my browser just to make sure it works. We can see that the script is working, so we know that the JavaScript file was called successfully. There's a couple of advantages to using external JavaScript files. First, it makes the HTML code and JavaScript code easier to maintain. Cached JavaScript files also increase the speed at which the web page loads. Different methods we can use for outputting data using JavaScript. The first we'll explore is the document.write method. Let's take a look at an example to see how this works. In this HTML page, we have a script that will display the result of a simple calculation using document.write. You can see here we have two values and we want to add them together, 5 plus 6. The result of this equation will be displayed in the content area of our web browser because we have attached the document.write function next to it. So here's the web browser, and we can see that the results are displayed beneath this line of text. So if we were to change the equation and save our file, it would update the value. And so it's that simple. That's how the document.write function works. Another method of outputting data is the window alert. This method will output the data in a pop-up message box. So let's replace the document.write with window.alert and see the difference. So now we can see that we get a pop-up message box with the value 13. InnerHTML function allows us to output data in an HTML element. For example, here we have a script that will calculate the results of a simple calculation, 6 plus 3. The script will display the result in the HTML element containing the ID math. That's what the getElementById function means. We've applied the ID to this paragraph tag. That means the results of the JavaScript output will be displayed here. We can see the results in our web browser. 9 is the result that is outputted once the JavaScript function computes 6 plus 3. We can update these values to output different results. Working with long, complex blocks of code, it's a good practice to leave comments that explain the function of the code. This helps you remember the purpose of the code and is especially useful if a third party will be working on the same script, such as another programmer or a team of programmers. JavaScript allows for single-line or multi-line comments. In this HTML file, we have a sample of both. The first is a single-line comment, represented by the double slash. It's placed above an executable JavaScript function. This means the JavaScript function will still be executed. We can see the result in our web browser. The word test is outputted using the InnerHTML function. In our next example, we've prevented a line of JavaScript code from executing by converting it into a comment. You can see that we've placed the double slash in front of the JavaScript code. So for this reason, the word paragraph is not outputted in our browser, despite using the InnerHTML function. If we remove the comment, the code does execute. Lastly, we have an example of a multi-line comment, and these are best used for explanations of large code blocks. To create one, use the slash and asterisk combination. JavaScript constants are values that are fixed. For example, in this script, we're adding two values, 5 and 6, together and outputting the result in a paragraph with the ID math. The values that we're adding are fixed values, 5 and 6. The value of these numbers is not dependent on any other factor. The 5 will always be 5, and the 6 will always be 6, unless we change them in the script. Let's preview this file to see the result in our web browser. Here we can see the outputted result 11. Constants can be in the form of numbers, both whole and integer, or strings. Strings are written within double or single quotes. We'll go ahead and change one of these values to a string. Now when we save the file and reload our web browser, we can now see that my text is joined with the value 6. We touched on variables in the introduction of this course. Variables are a very important concept to understand when it comes to programming in any language, including JavaScript. Unlike JavaScript constants, variables are named containers that can store a single value or multiple values. These values can change based on user inputs or other factors. Let's take a look at a basic example of how variables can be used to store values. In this JavaScript code, we've declared 3 variables: variable x, y, and z. You can think of each variable as a container. The variables each contain their own value. The value of variable x is 10. The value of variable y is 15. The value of variable z is equal to the sum of variable x and y, which in this case would be 25. or 10 plus 15. Now let's output the value of C using the getElementById output method. We'll output the result in a paragraph with the ID demo. Now let's save our file and preview it in our web browser to see the results. Here we can see our heading, JavaScript variables, and our paragraph, working with variables. And underneath that, we can see the result has been outputted. So variable X has been added to variable Y, and the result has been outputted to 25. In our example, the X, Y, and Z name we attach to the variable are known as variable identifiers. Each variable you declare must have a unique identifier. We used very short identifiers, but as we progress through the course, we will be using more descriptive identifiers. For example, color, shape, size, age, and weight. These would all be considered more descriptive. There are some general rules when selecting identifier names. Names can contain letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. Names must begin with a letter. Names are case sensitive. Reserved words, like JavaScript keywords, cannot be used as names. JavaScript variables can hold numbers like 100 or 10.5, or text values, for example, John Smith. Text values are known as text strings. Strings must be written in single or double quotes. Numbers can be written without quotes. If you put quotes around a number, it will be treated as a string. For the sake of this example, let's change our numerical value 15 to a text value. Now when we save our file and refresh our browser, we can see that the numerical value 10, stored within the X variable, has been attached to the string contained within variable Y. The output is contained within variable Z, which equals X plus Y. JavaScript, the equal sign is an assignment operator. This sounds more confusing than it is. It just means that the value of the left operand is equal to the right operand. In the equation, x equals y, the equal sign assigns the value of y to x. This is important because it allows us to compute values of two different data types, such as numbers and strings. Let's take a look at an example. In this JavaScript code, we're adding a numerical value with a text string. If we save the file and preview it in our web browser, we can see that the numerical value 30 is attached to the text string has. Arithmetic operators are used to perform arithmetic on numbers, both constants and variables. This chart provides a quick overview of the different operators that can be used. Now let's go over some examples to see how each one works. We'll begin by adding two numerical values. In between our open and close script tags, we'll create a variable called x. The value of x will be 100 plus 50. Next, we'll create our get element by ID, and the ID will be the word add. Now we'll go ahead and create the paragraph that'll contain the outputted value. Okay, now let's go ahead and save our file and preview it in our web browser. And we can see that we get the value 150, which is the correct value. Now let's go ahead and perform another calculation. This time we'll add two values and multiply the result by the value of another variable. So let's go ahead and define two variables. Variable A, which will equal 3. Variable B, which will equal 20 plus 30 multiplied by A. So in this case, it'll be multiplied by 3. Now we'll just create our output. We'll call the ID add2, and we'll display the result underneath our first calculation. And we'll save the file and refresh our web browser. So here we have, once again, 150 outputted. So that would be 20 plus 30, which is 50, multiplied by 3, which equates to 150. Okay, in this next example, we'll subtract two values. We'll call the variable C, and we'll do 100 minus 50, and this time we'll give it the ID sub, and we'll output the result at the bottom of our other two calculations. And there we have it. So that's how we multiply, add, and subtract. In this lesson, we'll explore a few other arithmetic operators. We'll begin with division. In this example, we'll divide two values together. We'll start by declaring a variable. We'll call it D. The value of D will be 100 divided by 50. Next, we'll set up our output. We'll call the ID div I. And we'll set up a paragraph in our body tag to display the output. And once we save our file, we'll go ahead and preview it in our web browser. And we can see that the correct value is outputted. Next, we'll increment the value of variable. So to do that, for this example, we'll go ahead and declare a variable called x and give it the value of 5. Next, type in x plus plus and a semicolon. This will increment the value of x by 1. So if x equals 5, the next value up would be 6. We'll store the incremented value in a variable called z. And then we'll go ahead and set up our output. Now we'll go ahead and save the file and refresh our web browser, and we can see the value 6 outputted below our last calculation. We can also decrement the value of a variable. So instead of going up, this time we'll set up a calculation, an arithmetic that decreases the value of the variable. So instead of going from 5 to 6, we'll go from 5 to 4. We'll set up a new variable, and we'll call this variable h. Next, type in h minus minus and the semicolon. We'll store the new value in a variable called k and set up our output. Now we'll save our file and refresh our web browser, and we can see that the value of k is outputted. Operator precedence determines the order in which operations are performed in an arithmetic expression. As in traditional school mathematics, the order of computations follows the following sequence: brackets, exponents, division, multiplication, addition, and subtraction. To illustrate this example, let's take a look at a basic equation. Here, we have 50 plus 200 in brackets multiplied by 3. In this equation, 50 would be added to 200 first. The result would then be multiplied by 3. We'll go ahead and test this in our web browser, and we can see we get the correct result, 750. JavaScript variables can hold many data types, including numbers, strings, arrays, and objects. On this slide, we can see that the first variable, age, contains a single numerical value, 16. The second variable, last name, stores a string, Johnson. The variable cars stores multiple strings. This is known as an array. We'll explore arrays in more detail later in this course. The last variable, person, is an object. Object variables also store multiple values, but each value is relevant to an assigned property. For this reason, each name and value in an object is referred to as a single property. In this case, first name John is our first property of the object person. Don't worry if you find this confusing. We'll work with objects later in this course. In this lesson, we're going to explore JavaScript objects. To best illustrate how objects work, let's think of a real-life object, a car for example. A car has various properties like name, model, weight, and color. We can include the values for each of these properties inside a single JavaScript object. In this example, we've defined a variable named car. The car variable is an object and contains several properties, including type, model, and color. If we wanted to output the value of a single property inside this object, we can use our getElementById output method. We can type car.type to output the car type. Let's go ahead and test this file in our web browser and see what the output results in. Here we can see that the output is Acura, which correctly reflects the type of the car. Now if we wanted to output the model, we simply need to update from car type to car model. We can save our file and refresh the page. And now we have the model outputted in our web browser. We can output multiple object property values in a single line of text, as shown in this script. Here, we have a variable object named person. This object has 4 different properties: first name, last name, age, and eye color. Using our getElementById output method, we can call multiple property values to form a sentence. Each value, in addition to the first one, can be added with a plus sign. The text strings in between the variable properties must be in quotes. This particular script will list the first property value, which is the first name. So for example, John has, and then the eye color property, so in this case blue. John has blue eyes. That will be the output in our web browser, and we can test that by launching this script in our web browser. And as you can see here, it outputs the correct sentence. We've worked a bit with JavaScript strings already. A string simply stores a series of characters, for example, John Smith. A string can be any text inside quotes. You can use both single and double quotes. Let's take a look at an example. In this script, we have 2 variables, student name 1 and student name 2. Each variable contains the full name of an individual. The first variable contains John Smith, and the second contains Roy Martin. As you can see, the first name is separated from the last name by a single space. The first variable is nested inside double quotes. The second is nested in single quotes. Both methods will work. We've outputted each string on an individual line, and we've separated each variable using the break tag. You might recall the break tag from the HTML section of this course. Let's take a look at what this script looks like in our web browser. Here we can see each variable outputted on its own line in our web browser. Now let's take a look at another example to illustrate the use of quotes inside of a string. We now have 3 variables, line 1, line 2, and line 3. In line 1, we use an apostrophe in the first word. This is acceptable in JavaScript. Variable line 2 and line 3 show the correct method of using quotes inside a string. You can use quotes as long as they don't match the quotes surrounding the string. So for variable line 2, we've used double quotes surrounding the string, and for that reason, single quotes around the name Xavier. On line 3, we've used single quotes surrounding the string, and for that reason we've had to use double quotes around the name Xavier. We'll save our file and preview it in our web browser, and we can see that everything works correctly. We can see the apostrophe in the first line. We can see our single quotes and our double quotes outputted from variable 2 and 3. We can determine the length of a string using the built-in property length. In this example script, we have a variable called txt, which contains all 26 letters of the alphabet. To output the length of this string, we can set our InnerHTML property to txt.length. With your file saved, preview it in your web browser, and you can see that it outputs the length of the variable, 26. As we're aware, strings must be written within quotes. Let's see what happens when we create a variable and put quotes inside of the string. In this example, we've placed quotes around the word players in our sentence. If we go ahead and preview this file in our web browser, we can see here that the text does not output as it should. To eliminate this issue, we need to use the \escape character. We must put one before the initial quote and one over here. Now when we save the file and refresh our web browser, we can see that the sentence correctly displays with quotations around the word players. And that is how you deal with special characters that you have issues with in JavaScript Output. Use JavaScript functions to generate a random number. This can be done using the math.random function. This function will generate a number between 0 and 1. Let's take a look at how it works using this example script. Here, we're using the getElementById output method to output a random number. And there's the math.random function. Let's go ahead and save the file and preview it in our web browser. Here, we can see a random number is generated. If we refresh the page, it'll generate different random numbers. The value is always between 0 and 1. You can use the math.min or math.max function to find the lowest or highest value in a list of arguments. This example script provides an illustration of how this works. Here, we have a list of numerical values. We can use the math.min function to locate and output the lowest value. In this case, the math.min function should output -150. Let's test this in our web browser to see if it works. We can see in our web browser that -150 is in fact outputted. But what if we wanted to see the maximum value listed in this sequence of numbers? In that case, all we have to do is update min to max, save the file, and refresh. Now we have the highest value in that list, 600. You can round decimal numbers to the nearest integer using the math.round function. In this example, we use the math.round function to round the value of 15.4 to the nearest integer. Since the value after the decimal is below 0.5, the number will be rounded to 15. We can test this in our web browser to confirm the results. This is the output in our web browser, and we can see that 15.4 has been rounded to 15. Now if we update the value to 15.6, the number will be rounded to 16. To specify whether the value should be rounded up or down, we can use the math.ceil or math.floor function. Let's go ahead and specify that we want 15.6 to be rounded down, so we'll change it to math.floor. After saving the file and refreshing the page, we can see that it now rounds down. If we wanted to round it up to 16, we can specify that by putting math.ceil. And once we refresh the web browser, we can see that the value has now been rounded up to 16. JavaScript arrays are used to store multiple values in a single variable. In this example, we've created an array variable called fruits and stored 6 values into it. each value contains the name of a fruit. The 6 values we have are apple, orange, pear, grape, tangerine, and mango. In order to output a specific value in the array, we can refer to it using an index number. The index number starts with 0. The first item in the array is identified by the index number 0, in this case, apple. If the index number was 1, we would be referencing orange, and so on. Since we've used an index number of 0, when we preview this in our web browser, we'll see that the word apple is displayed. This is the first item in the array. If we change the index number to 3, we'll see that the word displayed in our web browser changes to grape. And that's how we reference individual items in the array. In the situation where we wanted to display the number of items in the array, so for example here we have 6 items, we can use the length property. We've used the length property before. And when we save the file and refresh the page, we can see that the number 6 has been outputted because there are 6 items in the array. There are many ways that the values in an array can be outputted. We can output each value in the array by using the toString method. To do so, simply type in toString and an open and close bracket. I'll save the file and we'll preview this in our web browser. And we can see here that each item in the array has been outputted. You'll also notice that each value is separated by a comma. If you want to specify the separator, use the join method. In this case, we'll specify that we want an asterisk as the separator. Keep in mind that the asterisk is contained within an open and closed quotation, and we've also included an individual space before and after the asterisk. So after you've saved your file, refresh your web browser, and you'll see that the separator has now changed. You can remove the last element of an array from being outputted by using the pop method. In this case, the last element is mango. This will no longer be presented in our output. As you can see in our web browser, mango is not outputted. In order to remove the first word instead, or the first element, we can use the shift method. Now when we save our file and refresh our web browser, you'll see that mango reappears, but apple has been removed. To add a new element to the end of an array, we can use the push method. In this case, we'll add the word cherry to the very end of our output. And you can see that we now have a new element that has been outputted. To add a new element to the beginning of an array, we can use the Unshift method. We can see that the element cherry has now been added to the beginning of the array. Array elements can be changed using the index number. Let's change the first element of our array to kiwi. We'll start off with the name of the array, fruits, and then specify the index number corresponding to the value we want to amend. And that's it. Once we save our file, we can preview it in our web browser. And we can now see that the first value, apple, has been amended to kiwi. If we were to change the index number, let's say to 3, and save our file and refresh, we can see that grape has now changed to kiwi. We can also delete elements in an array using index numbers as well. Let's delete pear from our list of elements. Since pear would have the index number 2, we can type the following. We'll save our file. And in our web browser, we can now see that there is an empty space where pear would have appeared. Splice method can be used to add multiple new items to an array. This method also allows us to specify the position of the new elements and also if any elements should be removed. Let's go through an example to better illustrate this concept. Say we wanted to add 2 fruits, lemon and banana, after the second element in our array, which is orange. To do this, we can type the following. We start with the variable name, and then we create our splice method. The value 2 indicates that we want the new elements to start with an index number of 2. The 0 indicates that we do not want to remove any of the other elements in our array. Once we save our file and preview it in our web browser, we can see that lemon and banana have been added after orange. Lemon does have an index value of 2. So the output is correct. You can sort an array alphabetically using the sort method. This sample script includes an array variable named cars. There are 4 elements in the array: Volvo, Acura, Honda, and Lexus. Let's go ahead and add the sort method into the script to sort the elements alphabetically from A to Z. We start with the variable name, cars, and then enter the sort method. We'll save our file and preview it in our web browser to make sure it worked. We can see here that each array element is now sorted in alphabetical order. We can also reverse sort the elements in an array using the reverse method. To do so, simply type the following line of code into your script. Now when we refresh the page, you'll notice that each element item is in reverse order. You can join 2 arrays using the concat method. In this sample script, we have two arrays, one named girls and the other boys. The girls array has 4 elements: Julie, Samantha, Laura, and Jill. The boys array has 5 elements: Bob, Joe, Walt, Sam, and Fred. The third variable is named combined. This variable will store the element values of both arrays using the concat method. To output these values, we can use our getElementById output method. Let's go ahead and preview this file in our web browser to see what the output looks like. Here we can see that the elements of both arrays have been outputted as we intended. When programming in any language, it's very common to create logic that performs different actions based on one or more conditions. JavaScript has a variety of conditional statements that we'll explore in this lesson. We'll be exploring the if, else, and else-if statements. These statements allow us to execute an action contained within a block of code if certain conditions are met. Let's take a look at how this works with a simple example. We'll create a script that converts a student's numerical test score into a letter grade. To keep it simple, we'll assume the test was out of 100 marks. First, we need to define the grading system. Let's say that a score of 0 to 49 equals an F, 50 to 69 equals a D, 70 to 79 equals a C, 80 to 89 equals a B, and 90 to 100 inclusive, equals an A. In order to do this, we need to start by creating our test score variable and assigning a value. We'll call the variable score. And we'll assign a value of 65 for now. Keep in mind that we'll make changes to this score to test our script later on. Next, we'll need to start with our first if statement. If the score is less than 50, we want to output an F. So start by typing if score is less than 50, we will output an F using the document.write method. If the score is greater than 50 but less than 70, we want to output a D. Since we're adding a condition to our original if statement, we must start this condition with the else if statement. I'll copy this else if statement because we're going to create a few others. So the next one we need is if the score is greater than 70 but less than 80, we want to output a C. This is for if the score is greater than 80 but less than 90, we'll output a B. And if the score is greater than 90 or equal to 100, we want to output an A. Now the last thing we want to do is if the score is anything above 100, we need to display an error message indicating that the score must be less than 100. because the exam was out of 100 marks. For this, we'll use the else statement. The else statement instructs the script on what to do if none of the preceding conditions have been met. And now I'll go ahead and save this file and preview it in our web browser. So here we have D that has been outputted because our current score, we've set it to 65. Now that is greater than 50 and less than 70. So if we were to change our score, let's go ahead and change the score to 81. And in this case, it correctly outputs a B because that's over 80 but less than 90. Now let's see what will happen if we create a score above 100. Okay, so our else statement is working. The score must be less than 100. And so you can go ahead and play with that, but that's basically how the if, else if, and else statements work, also known as conditional statements. Comparison operators are used to compare the equality or difference between variables or values. There are several comparison operators that can be used in JavaScript. This chart provides an overview of each one. We'll go through a few of them to demonstrate how they work. In this test script, we've created a variable and assigned it a value of 6. We'll use the getElementById method to output a true or false result when using different comparison operators to compare our variable value with another value. Let's start with our equal to operator. Let's test to see if our variable value is equal to 8. We know that this is not the case, so our script should output the word false when we test it in our web browser. So I'll save this file and just test it in the browser. And we can see that it does in fact output the word false. If we were to change the value to 6, and refresh our web browser, the output is true because our variable value x is in fact equal to 6. We can use the not equal operator to see if our variable is not equal to 10, for example. This is the symbol for not equal. We'll update the 6 to 10. So we know that our variable value 6 is not equal to 10. So when we test this in our web browser, it should display true, which it does. Now if we were to change this to 6, it should display false because our variable value is in fact equal to 6. You can test out the remaining comparison operators and see what the outcome produces. The Boolean function can be used to find out if an expression or variable is true. As a general rule, everything with a real value is true. This includes both numerical and string data. Anything without a real value is false. Let's take a look at an example. In this script, we have 7 variables declared, b1 to b7. Each variable uses the Boolean function to test whether a specified value is true. Using the getElementById method, we can output the data. Let's take a look at this page in our web browser to see the results. We can see in our browser that all the numbers, including 80, 2.6, -10, are true. The same goes for variable b6, which contained the equation. The strings included in variable b4 and b5 are also true. The last variable, variable b7, which contained the value 0, is false. A for loop allows us to execute a block of code repeatedly. They come in handy if you want the same code to run over and over again, each time with a different value. Let's take a look at an example to illustrate how for loops work. The objective of the for loop we create will be to output the values 0 to 10 on separate lines in our HTML document, as shown here. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do is declare the variable that will contain our initial values. We'll call this variable count. Now we can create our for loop. To do so, type the following block of code. And that's it. In this block of code, we first established the for loop. Next, we've defined the parameters of the for loop. We've set the initial value for variable count to 0. We then instruct the script that the value should increment by 1 up to a maximum of 10. The document.write functions simply output each value in the loop separated by a line break. So let's go ahead and save this file and test it in our web browser to make sure it works. And we can see here that each value is outputted onto a separate line, just as we instructed it to do. Now let's see what would happen if we were to change the value of our count variable to a different value. I'll change it to 3, save the file, and refresh. Now we can see that our initial value starts at 3 and increments up to 10. We can increase our maximum value by changing 10 to 20, for example. And now it'll keep looping until it reaches 20 instead of 10. JavaScript for in loop loops through the properties of an object. In this example script, we've created an object variable called person. The object contains 3 elements: fname, lname, and age. The for in loop will loop through each item of the object and output the data. Let's go ahead and test this in our web browser to see the result. We can see that each item in the object has been outputted: John Smith and 30. While loop will loop through a block of code as long as a specified condition is met. Let's take a look at an example. We'll create a script that outputs the values of a variable as long as the value does not exceed 20. We will start by creating a variable to store our initial value. We'll call this variable I. We'll assign the value 0 to this variable. Now we can create our while loop. Here we've instructed our script to output the value of I as long as the value does not exceed 20. The while loop will loop over and over 19 times in this case. Each time it will output the value of I started at 0 and incremented by 1. So let's go ahead and save this file and preview it in our web browser. So we can see that the value starts at 0, that's the initial value of I, and it's incremented by 1 up until 19. We can modify our script if we adjust our maximum value to 40. We can now see that it goes up to 39. We can also adjust the value of I if we wanted to start the incrementing at 5. And that is how the while loop works. While loop is a variation of the while loop. A do-while loop will always execute the entire code block once before checking if a condition is met. If the condition is met after the first pass, it will then loop the code block as long as the condition remains true. Let's take a look at an example to illustrate this. On this HTML page, we have a JavaScript function that's executed when a button is clicked. We can see the onClick event in our button element that triggers the function named myFunction. The function in our JavaScript tag starts with defining a variable named I with an initial value of 0. Then we have the syntax for our do-while loop. This loop will start by outputting the value of I and incrementing it by 1. It will continue to loop and increment as long as the value of I is less than 10. We can see this condition defined in our while parameter. Let's click the button to see the result. We can see the loop starts at 0 because that's the initial value of I. The value of I is then incremented. It is incremented until the value of I reaches 9, which is less than 10. Now let's see what would happen if we were to change the initial value of I to 11. We can see that the output is now 11. This is because the loop executed once, but it does not execute again because this condition is no longer met after the first pass. You can use the JavaScript break and continue statements to either exit a loop or skip an iteration of a loop. Let's start with the break statement. In this example, we've declared a variable I. Next, we have a for loop that sets the initial value of I to 0 and defines our loop to execute as long as I remains under 10, so from 0 to 9. We then have an if statement that will stop the loop if the value of I hits 3, and that's what the break statement allows us to do. In our web browser, we can confirm that the loop did stop when I hits 3. You can see it, we only have the value 0, 1, and 2 outputted. If we replace the break statement with a continue statement, we can skip an iteration of the loop when the value is equal to 3. The loop will continue as normal after the skipped iteration. So you can see that we go to 0, 1, 2, 3 is skipped, and then the loop continues onward until the value 9. You can use JavaScript functions to create blocks of code that perform particular tasks when called upon. Let's take a look at an example to illustrate how functions work. Here in our script tags, we've defined a function called myFunction. This function has two parameters, a and b. You can call your function anything you like. The name can contain letters, digits, underscores, and $signs. The code to be executed inside the function is placed within a set of curly brackets. In this case, the function is meant to output the value of a multiplied by b. To do this, we use a return statement. It's important to note that a function will stop executing once it reaches the return statement. The values of a and b are contained in our InnerHTML function, in this case 8 and 2. These values are known as arguments. They define the values of the parameters inside the function, in this case a and b. And you can see that we've referred back to the function name as well before inserting our arguments in the brackets. We can see in our web browser that the arithmetic was performed, as 8 times 2 is 16. One of the key benefits of functions is they can be used as many times as needed with different arguments to produce different results. For example, to multiply different values in place of 8 and 2, simply update the arguments. Now we're multiplying 6 and 5, and you can see that the output is correct, 30. Use different types of events in our HTML document to execute JavaScript code. There are many different types of events, but some common events include mouse clicks, mouse overs, mouse out, key down, and document load. Let's take a look at a basic on-click event. In our sample HTML file, we have a button element that will display the time when clicked. In this case, the event is the click, and the function that is triggered is the date function. We've used the InnerHTML statement to display the output. You can see in our web browser when I click the time button, the date is displayed, the date and time. We can change on-click to on-mouse over. And now the function will be triggered when I hover my mouse over the button. I don't need to click. If we change it to on-mouse out, the date will be displayed once my mouse is out of the button area. Now that we have a better understanding of how JavaScript works, it would be a good time to work on a couple of projects. First, we'll start with a simple script that changes the background color of a web page every time the page is refreshed. We can see the end result in this example. Every time I press the refresh button, you can see that the background color is changing. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing you need to do is set up your basic HTML page structure and save the file on your computer. Next, create your script tags inside the body tags. Inside our script, we need to define a variable that stores all the possible background colors in an array. So here, we have a variable called bgcolor, and it stores 8 values inside an array, and each value is a hex code representing a different color. You can use the same colors we've used, or different colors if you like. Now we'll need to create a JavaScript statement that will randomly select one of the colors in our array and apply it as the background color each time the page is refreshed. So to do that, we've used the document body style property and set it to a randomized value in the bgcolor array index. The value of the index is derived by multiplying a random value between 0 and 1, and that's done using the math.random statement. We've multiplied it by the length of the array, which is 8. We then use the math.floor statement to round the value to the nearest whole number. So this gives us the value of our index number in the bgcolor array. And each time it's going to be different. So that means each time the background color will be different as well. And that's it for the script. Once you're done, just save the file and preview it in your web browser. This project will be developing a JavaScript and CSS-based photo gallery. The gallery has a set of thumbnails at the top and a main preview image displayed below. When a user hovers their mouse over the thumbnail, the main preview image changes to the corresponding thumbnail. There's also a hover effect on the thumbnails and some CSS styling for the borders, background color, and text formatting. Before we get started, you'll need to download the images folder that contains the images for this exercise from the downloads folder. Once you've done so, you must place the entire images folder in the same directory that you'll be saving your HTML file into. With that complete, let's go ahead and get started. Create your basic HTML page structure and save the file. You can give it any file name you like. Next, we'll need to create a style sheet for our page with several style rules. The first rule will style the page elements. We've set the background color of the body to hex code 222. We've created a margin at the top of the page. We've set the default font family to Arial and the color of the default font color to white. The next rule here is a class definition for the thumbnails. In this class, we've defined the height as 80 pixels, border is 4 pixels solid with a hex code of 555, 1 pixel padding, and some margin on the left and the right. So that's what gives us this look for each thumbnail image. Next, we have a class for the hover effect on the thumbnails. This will change the color of the border to a 4 pixel solid border with this hex code, and that's a light blue color. And the last style we have here is the class that will style the main preview image. We've given the preview image a border, some padding, and a width of 800 pixels. With our style sheet created, we can now build the elements in our body tags. Start with creating a container that will hold all our objects. We'll give it a center alignment. Next, we'll create a heading for the page using header tags, and then just add a break after the header. Now we'll create a div that will contain the main preview image. The class we've applied to this div is preview, so that is going to be styled using our preview style definition up here. We've given it a center alignment. It's important to note that we've also inserted the default image that will be displayed when the page loads, and we've given this image a name, preview, and we've set the source to image 1 in our images folder. So keep that in mind, that it's important to note that we've named it preview because we'll be using this in just a moment. The next thing I'm going to insert here is the code block for the thumbnails. So the thumbnails will be contained in a div, and the class we've applied to the div is the thumbnails class. So the styling will come from these two definitions here. You can see that we've inserted 5 images inside this div, and each one has a JavaScript on mouse over event. When we hover our mouse over thumbnail 1, for example, the preview image is changed to a different source. So here's the image preview. Its source is changed to image 1 for the first image, image 2 for the second, image 3, image 4, and image 5. So that's what gives us the on mouse over effect. The image that's displayed will correspond to its matching thumbnail. And of course, we've set the source of the thumbnail for each image. And that's it, that's the entire script. So when you've completed that, just go ahead and save the file and preview it in your web browser to see the end result.